Welcome to the next episode of the HR Mavericks podcast. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by a familiar guest, someone who's been here a few times before, Mr. Stephen Farber. Stephen, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Garrett. Thanks for having me on. I think this is the third time, right?
I think it is, and we are super excited to have you on the show. I know, your previous two episodes that we've done, months in the past are some of my favorites that we've done and some of our listeners' favorites too. We were just joking before we jumped on here that it seems like every time you come back, you have a different title, different company, right? So now you're the Vice President of Training and Certifications at Take Flight Learning. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
So tell our listeners who might not have heard your previous episodes a little bit more about you, your background, and what you're currently doing in your job right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see if I can kind of give a succinct background about myself. So again, my name is Stephen Farber. I'm a vice president at Take Flight Learning. Take Flight Learning. It's been one of those days. And so a little bit about me. I was a participant in the Great Resignation, right? My initial reaction whenever I was part of the droves that walked away was, wow, I got to figure out a way to help other people not have to go through this. From compensation issues to underappreciation, culture problems, whatever may have been happening, after the pandemic, during the pandemic that caused people to walk away, I wanted to really help people get in front of it because that was me. I felt like that was my life there. But one thing that I kind of missed was, even though I thought employers were these calloused opponents that just really wanted to push me out the door, it turns out for the most part, and I'm sure this is true of a lot of people, that employers don't like losing people. They hate people walking away more than we hate leaving. So what I did is I got into this and I did some investigation, Garrett, and what I found was that there's these patterns that occur. And if I could figure out a way to kind of isolate these patterns of discontent, I thought, I can really bring some impactful insights into the engagement world and figure out how we can keep more people from leaving, people like me, and how to really build that job satisfaction so that employees don't just want to jump ship, because there's a lot of options these days. And that drove me into a lot of different things. If you go back to those past episodes, I was in employee benefits. Then I had started my own company called Hero Culture, which was in the name of bringing a positive experience that was long lasting and impactful to lots of company cultures in the form of communication training. That's kind of where I hit on, but I wasn't quite sure what I was doing there. I just knew that it had something to do with communication. And then, of course, I'm at where I'm at now. I was introduced to the DISC personality world and team building and kind of tried to do that on my own. It was mildly successful, but eventually was very happy to join the team at Take Flight Learning, where we do this worldwide for people now, just bringing all kinds of things from personality to emotional intelligence to team building events, just to really help teams grow, communicate better, and ultimately want to stay. So that's a little bit about where I was, where I'm at, and really what my mission is in this life per se.
I love it. I love how seeing every time you come back, every time we chat, seeing that evolution of you add a little bit more to what it is to like your personal mission, right? And it seems like you're in a place that's perfect for you right now based on those previous conversations. Like Stephen mentioned, for some of our listeners out there, if you go back and for some of you who've listened for a while, there was the DISC personality is the last one that Stephen did. Some of you might remember it as the bird personality. Stephen is our bird man, right? It's the different types of birds out there. And so if you followed Stephen at all, he's talked a lot about that. But I'm really excited to dive into our topic today because I think it's just an evolution. Again, just like you and your career, it's an evolution of the past conversations that we've had on this show. And I think that it kind of ties them all together. So as you and I talked about, what do we talk about today on this episode? You kind of proposed this idea of something you mentioned a minute ago, emotional intelligence, and how that can impact workplaces, make them better physically, psychologically, safer workplaces, so that there's better output for the companies and better enjoyment and fulfillment and engagement from employees. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's jump into that. I guess just to set the stage, one of the things we really like to do is really just define what we're talking about so that we're all on the same page. We often do that on episodes. So tell us what you mean when you say emotional intelligence. I think that's something that it's a term that's popped up a lot more in the last few years, especially, fortunately, but I think it's something that's still a little fuzzy for some people. So what's your definition of emotional intelligence?
Thank you. And it's rightfully so fuzzy because EQ is like what we like to say is kind of like drinking from a fire hose. It is a broad topic. And oddly enough, we ask that question a lot at the beginning of our training is like, what is emotional intelligence? So it's funny having that posed back to me because I'm like, oh, I got to answer it this time. And, it's the best way that I would say to answer it is kind of in the thought of, or rather in the metaphor of a path is it's kind of like following a path on the way to learning how to perceive our emotions and how to understand them. And what I mean by that is once we perceive and understand them in a way that is more self-aware, it allows us to control them. Because if we don't control our emotions, they're going to control us. That's kind of a one-way street, this way or that way. And I think a lot of people live their lives just being controlled by their own emotions. And it's not, I don't blame them because it is hard to actually step back and realize our inner narrative is often pretty darn negative. And, there's all kinds of people who have a lot to say on that, but it's definitely a skill that can be brought to the table. And it's one that affects so many areas. And that's why I wanted to talk about this topic, is something that really blew my mind was when I learned that EQ directly affects workplace safety. And it comes in kind of two parts. And this will be the second kind of half of that question. Is the first one is it definitely affects on the job safety, like physical safety, getting hurt in the real world. But what's even more interesting is the psychological safety bit. And, while physical is not getting hurt, psychological safety is, I think the best way to explain it is it's feeling safe in expressing your ideas and not feeling like they're going to be condemned, shot down, or you're going to be punished for them. So yeah, EQ helps in both of those areas. And I hope I kind of went a long way around answering your question, but yeah, that's how I would define it. And that is how it connects. And I'll kind of explain how it connects to psychological and workplace safety as we continue on here.
Yeah, I love it. So again, emotional intelligence, or EQ, is really, the abbreviation for that, right? And it's really about, like I heard you say, understanding your emotions, right, and being able to help and identify the emotions of others that you interact with. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I got to ask this question because I know that there's some people out there who might not be as familiar with, the study of EQ, who might be like me, might be the skeptic sometimes, right? I had the fortunate chance to actually take an EQ course a couple of years ago. Found it fascinating. But let me play devil's advocate here for a minute, right? Because one of the things you said was really interesting. Your emotions and understanding those, definitely you can see how that ties to a psychologically safer workplace. But you also mentioned a physically safer workplace. So, let's take, for example, someone who works in a warehouse. How does emotions and understanding of their own EQ lead to the fewer safety violations, or the safer physical workplace?
Gotcha. No, that's a really great question. I'm actually having to dig into my notes for this and that's the thing with EQ is it's not necessarily a simple short answer because emotions aren't simple either most of the time. But to answer your question, let's dig into the world of personality just a little bit. So let me pull out the personality of the eagle here. And if anybody has watched that last show, eagles are going to be more of the dominant, decisive type of personality. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally.
Right. So if you have an eagle, they're technically people who exude a lot of confidence in the workplace. They know where they're going. They're not going to ask a committee about getting something done. They are to the point. But an eagle can have a low emotional intelligence whenever it comes to a self-awareness or confidence, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So what does an eagle with low confidence look like? Do you have what does that look like to you, Garrett? What would that person seem like?
Let's see, an eagle with low confidence, they're probably someone who on the outside seems like they have, it all together. They're pretty decisive, but they second guess themselves often on the inside. They want to prove themselves a little bit at times, and their ability to, be smart and capable and seen as that.
Right. No, you're right on the mark. Yeah, basically they're constantly second guessing who they are. They don't feel nearly as confident as they naturally exude. So what happens is they overcompensate, right? So as instead of someone who is this direct, decisive worker who is really goal oriented, you end up getting a bully instead.
Hmm.
And that's rough, because this person, if they're unsure about themselves, they consider anything that they screw up on a personal failure. So in order not to actually, take the blame for that, they're going to overcompensate. So that directness becomes aggression. That decisive assuredness becomes this arrogant, almost a condescending, just pushiness. And the reason I bring all this up, because I'm going to answer your question about how this relates to physical safety. If there is a potential safety hazard or a violation or something that's not quite right, this person probably is not going to bring it up if they feel like it's going to tie it back to them, because they're going to be afraid of being judged for that. The other thing is someone else may not want to bring that up to them because they're going to be afraid of getting lashed or getting lashed out at because of that. So it affects not only themselves, because if they admit that there's a problem, that's a personal failure and they can't have that. But it also makes it hard for other people to approach them, because they're like, I really think this is a problem, but I am not going to go tell Steven about it because he will eat me alive. So now you have this problem that's not being solved because of emotions. Then somebody actually gets hurt. Then it's an even bigger problem, because now you're looking at productivity, people walking away, all kinds of stuff. Now you have an all different set of emotions going on. You might have OSHA get involved. Who knows? All of it happens, though, and it's not just egos. Everybody has a problem. If you're a parrot, you might turn into the biggest narcissist you've ever met. It depends on who you are. But the point is if you don't know that you have this trait that's low in EQ, you're going to just act out of instinct, and you're going to naturally cause problems to, develop in the background that'll result in bigger problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, total sense. So like, if I can just reiterate what I heard you say is really, as business leaders and managers and also employees better understand how we're wired in many ways, kind of going back to, the disc personalities, the bird analogies, like you just talked about, and also better understand our emotional tendencies that are kind of tied to those dominant personality traits, that can help us spot some of these potential failures and hopefully overcome them before they happen, right? To leading to fewer accidents in the workplace, or generally a safer work environment, whether physically or psychologically. Is that right? Anything I missed there?
No, you're right on the money. And just to add to that, what we describe is largely how you prevent something physical from happening. You go over to the psychological safety side, psychological safety being the actual ability to feel safe voicing your opinions. If you don't feel safe, if you're not self-assured, or if someone else is so overbearing that you're terrified of being self-assured, it's not a psychologically safe workplace either. And there's probably so many of those that are just really dependent on a low EQ culture. And the key to actually raising EQ is to start with that awareness that, hey, we're in a low EQ culture. And then from there, you can start looking at what the high EQ cultures look like, and you can really just mimic it. That's how simple it can be. The hard part is getting people to stop and say, oh, this is a problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So I think you kind of hit on what I want to go to next, which really is just what does a low EQ culture in a business look like versus a high EQ culture? And how do you first identify that? And then how do you move your company to be more like that high EQ culture?
No, that's a really good question. It's also a big one to unpack. And you know what? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab an EQ profile here. And typically what we've done when we do trainings like this is what we do. We point out what the low EQ is, what the high EQ is, and then we have strategic actual activities around that. But I would say some of the low EQ cultures, let's just start with leaders, for example. So if your leadership if the appearance is closed-mindedness, they're not open to new ideas, they're not willing to actually reach out and help someone, that could point to a low EQ area in the social awareness aspect. And what I mean by that is they're not aware of how they're actually treating the people who are around them. So for instance, if you have somebody who is very kind of systematized, very systems oriented, and they like things everything in it, everything, a place for everything and everything in its place. Easy for me to say, right? The way, and they have a whole team of people that may not think that way. What that person, the high EQ trait would actually be to be able to read that room and know, you know what, I'm not actually connecting with everybody here. What I need to do is I need to stop, slow down. Maybe I need to have some individual meetings with each one of these people, really ask, hey, what do you think about this? What are your qualms? What do you like about it? What do you not like? The ability to read the room is a high EQ trait. If you just assume, and this can be someone with a lot of confidence, is they can actually fall into this hole sometimes. Confidence isn't always the key to everything. You know what? I nailed this. Everything's good. We're great. And then you just shut it down. And in your mind, you're like, yeah, the way I'm going to do it is perfect. But if you don't actually know that, if you can't read the room and see that your team is, there's a couple people who are shaking their heads. My favorite are the dove personalities, where they will not they'll say yes on the outside, but inside they're saying, no, I hate this. But they're not going to tell you in the meeting. They might have a little mini meeting after the meeting in the hallways. Yeah. A lot of people will notice that sometimes. Oh, look, sir, there's meetings going on after the meeting. It's because there was an actual total agreement. So let me back up and just kind of answer that more succinctly. High EQ workplace would be a workplace that's really good at reading the room. They're open to ideas, even if it's in conflict to their current one. The actual ability to step back and listen is high EQ. It shows an openness. If you're closed to that, that's low EQ. So, and the way that you would raise that, and this is kind of the neat thing about it, is it really comes down to knowing what high and low is. If you know what the end goal looks like and you know where you are, you know where you have to go, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I think, the next, probably the $1 million question, which I don't know if there's like a end all be all answer to this, but I'm curious your thoughts on it, is, can you really change EQ? Like those people who are wired that way, right? Who are the people who don't naturally read the room very well? Is it something that they're just born with, or is it a skill or a trait that people can actually improve over time?
And that's my favorite question. So short answer, absolutely. It is not like IQ. It's not static. And personality style, while personalities can change, and, with a lot of effort, sometimes a trauma can change personalities, big life events, getting married, adopting a child, having a child, like that at all will change it. EQ is the one thing between personality and emotional intelligence. EQ can be actively changed, and everybody can go to 0 to 100. Like you're not necessarily wired to have a medium to low EQ like you might have with an IQ. EQ can be maxed for everybody, is from what I understand from Daniel's original work, and for what we have put together today over on our team is it's actively able to be changed. And that's why it's such a big deal for people to get on board with, because it is 100% leverageable today.
Awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. So let's say, for instance, I am a small business leader, or maybe an HR person. I hear this podcast. I think, I think we do work in a fairly low EQ culture, and I want to change that at our company. What would you recommend as like the next step? What should someone like that do to really start down that path of raising the collective EQ of their company?
That's a really good question. The first thing I would say is the biggest step is realizing that you're in a low EQ culture, and you're not alone, because low EQ is so much more common. And really, low EQ is just people not understanding what EQ is. Once you understand, I say understand EQ. Understanding EQ is a huge, again, it's a fire hose of information, but understanding that you might not be in a high EQ situation, that immediately raises your EQ, because you've just hit self-awareness. And that's a big part of those 4 components, which I didn't mention this initially, but those 4 components, again, are going to be self-awareness, social awareness, and then self-management. And relationship management, that's the 4th one. So, and by the way, there's 18 pieces to all of those as well. So yes, very changeable, not a problem there.
Got it. Awesome. And so let's bring this back then to what we originally started talking about, which is how EQ, emotional intelligence, can actually make your workplace safer, right? And so how does this EQ and just mindfulness kind of in general of where you're at, where your company's at, how other people perceive you in those relationships there. What are the results of starting down that path of changing it? How does it make people safer and happier at work? And especially if you have any examples of those that you've worked with and or evolutions you've seen in companies where they have started down that path and what the result has been.
Right, right. Yeah, no, to answer your first question, really, it all starts with digging into the four components of EQ and then going from there. Just understanding what you're in, like we answered in that previous question, immediately raises your EQ. One that I really want to point to, we'll just focus on one component here, just self-awareness. For instance, self-awareness has four components. There's emotional clarity, self-reflection, cause and effect, and confidence. Just focusing on confidence. If you have low confidence at work, no matter your job, you're much more prone to make mistakes. And one mistake can lead to another mistake, which then reinforces the belief that you just make mistakes all the time, which I'm not saying is true about anyone. I felt that way about myself for a long time. But, our brains are geared for survival. So they're going to find these processes that we're doing. They're going to do the best they can to keep us away from what hurts. And if we have low emotional intelligence in the form of confidence and we make mistakes, our brain's going to get us away from doing the things that we actually need to be doing to get better. And of course, when it comes to safety, especially psychological safety, which I think psychological safety is directly going to correlate to physical safety anyway. If we want to have a workplace that we feel safe to express ourselves in, if we really want true inclusion and diversity and equity, we have to feel like we can speak. And if we have low EQ and confidence and self-reflection, cause and effect, those areas, if we don't know what it looks like to have it higher in those areas, then we're going to just make more mistakes. We're not going to be able to connect the dots. And then people are really going to get hurt in real life. And then if we have bullies that develop or things like that, we know the problem that bullies can cause in childhood. We know that the rates of people who get hurt and suicides and all these terrible things that happen. And then you can have these develop in your workplace. So it's very worth having the ability to understand, is this person just a hateful person? Or do they not understand that they're exhibiting a low EQ trait? Let's teach them how to raise it. All of a sudden, you've turned a detractor into an absolute outstanding rock star leader. So I'm kind of going all over the place. Let me reel it back in here. What was the second half of that question?
Yeah. Just if you had any examples of good examples of companies or people that you've worked with through this process.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because I'm not picking on eagles. I promise. They're my favorite type. I'm not an eagle. I wish I was. One of my bosses. So I promise, Jeff, this isn't on you. But eagles, I would say, we had a training a while back, and the crazy thing about this is we were going through high and low traits and what somebody in overuse in a style looks like. That directness turning into aggression, it's somewhat accidental becoming this bully. And you have this manager in the back, and he's one of the leaders at the company. And I should, disclaimer, if you're an eagle, that doesn't make you a leader, and it doesn't mean only eagles can lead. We can all lead. This just happened to be a leader who was an eagle. And we're talking about the most, according to his own people, hard-nosed, very intense, very direct person. And we have lots of examples of these, but this one in particular, as the training is concluding, he begins to break down in tears. And of course, everybody's looking around like, this person can cry? I didn't know that. Like, whoa, what is happening? And he came to the realization in his own words, he's like, oh my gosh, I've been a total a-hole. I can't believe it. I didn't know. And, at first it's like, oh, is he playing the victim? But these people, when you're in overuse, when you have these low EQ traits, when you are being super, super intense and you don't realize what you're doing, you don't realize how overbearing you're being to someone else, it hurts. Well, it's almost a release to realize that you can change. But until you know that you can change, it's something that you'll never actually change. So sorry, I'm a little confused myself there. But that's probably my favorite example, is just when you're able to show these differences, you can actually help people realize themselves what they're actually doing. And once somebody picks that up on their own, that's when the real change happens. You can't force someone to change, but if they can realize it themselves, the results they're incredible.
Yeah, no, I love that example, because I think that it's eye-opening when you start down this process of learning about EQ, learning about how you're wired, learning about how, you might have intended one thing and someone perceived it a completely different way. And I totally see how, by starting down that path and making progress on it, it can, if you can, have a culture of doing that in your company where that's accepted and encouraged, that it totally leads to psychologically and physically safer environments, workplaces. So it's definitely applicable. And I love the example that you shared, because I think it is eye-opening for many people who maybe just hadn't thought about this before. And then they start down this process and they realize, oh my goodness, must be how I've been perceived, and I need to do something to change. And that's perfect, because that's kind of like you said, the first step in this process of realizing that there needs to be a change, realizing that there could be a better way or to communicate your ideas. And again, coming back to you and what we talked about with, your journey in your career, again, I see how this fits in perfectly for you, Stephen, of, this idea of communication, personality styles, and bringing that all together under this umbrella of EQ to create better, engaged, safer workplaces for people. And, that's a noble mission that I think every company needs to be improving on. So salute you for, that personal mission and where it's led you in your career. And I think that this is an awesome next step.
Oh, thank you so much. A lot of kind words there. So appreciate you.
Anything else you would say to this topic of EQ, specifically if there are people who are listening who are intrigued by this idea or this topic, who want to learn more about it? What would you recommend that they do as a next step?
Yeah, I like to keep it very simple. I actually have a ebook on this that I wrote. It's 100% free. I don't know why I use percent. It's a free ebook. You can actually just go to my LinkedIn. It's right in the banner. It's also in my resource section, and you can download that for free. And it kind of breaks down a little bit of what I've talked about here today, along with more of a step-by-step process of how to introduce this idea to your workforce. And there's also, in addition to that, there's some resources about the personality styles, how to combine those with EQ, which is something that we do that not a lot of I don't know if anybody else does that. We just, I think it's the best way to do it. But that way you can find your bullies, you can find your detractors, you can find the people who may not even know they're causing problems, and bring a more emotionally intelligent workforce to your workforce. And the ebook is called The Emotionally Intelligent Workforce. So in the name of redundancy, I hope I've answered your question.
You definitely have. We will drop a link for anyone listening. We'll drop a link to Stephen's LinkedIn profile and also that ebook in the show notes, so you can find those there. So Stephen, thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us today. If there are listeners that want to connect with you or learn more about working with your company, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. There's a couple of different ways. Again, I never log off of LinkedIn. It's a problem. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always on there. You can also visit us at takeflightlearning.com. And of course, those are really the major two ways. There's some other information. We got a phone number, we have an email, all that fun stuff. But yeah, takeflightlearning.com, or catch me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn/in is Stephen Farber. It's my name. So feel free to look that up.
Perfect. Thanks again, Stephen. It's great connecting with you, catching up as always, and I'm looking forward to our next episode sometime in the future.
Sounds good. We'll make it happen.
Thanks, Stephen. We'll see you.